Hi, my name is Shri, and I am a PhD student in clinical and developmental psychology, doing research in developmental and cognitive neuroscience. And I'm here to tell you the three things that you really need to know to help yourself better consume and understand science. So let's go. So the first thing is one study is never enough to prove a phenomenon. So I'm sure you've read like news articles on Yahoo or wherever you consume news about how eating an apple is bad for you or eggs are bad for you. And then the next day it's like eating an apple is good for you and eggs are good for you. And it just seems to like wobble back and forth. And a lot of the time those news articles will maybe cite a couple studies that kind of prove that eggs are bad for you or apples are bad for you or whatever it is. But I'm here to tell you that one study is never enough to prove anything. So how we sort of prove something in science is we take a bunch of studies and we look at the results across all of these studies that are looking at the same phenomenon. And we call this a meta-analysis. And the reason we do this is because anytime we have a study, there is always a chance of error. So just like everything else that humans do, we make mistakes or there's just variables and things that are out of our control. So for instance, let's say a participant comes in for a study that we're recruiting for and they're really sick that day, but they don't tell us. And so their results are disrupted. Or maybe someone wrote some code to analyze the data and there's a bug in it and we didn't know. Stuff like this. So there's always this margin of error, which is why one study, again, is never enough to prove a phenomenon. Okay, so one study isn't enough to prove anything. So what do we do with that? So you can look up what's called a meta-analysis, like I mentioned before, into Google Scholar on the topic that you're looking at. So let's say you want to know if organic food is actually really beneficial for you compared to non-organic food. And you can look up organic versus non-organic meta-analysis. And that paper should include some details about what a bunch of studies have found and kind of the general consensus across them. The second thing that you should know is a lot of neuroscience and psychology research focuses on the average. So what I mean by this is studies take large samples of people and look at the average trend between X and Y. So for instance, let's say, we have a bunch of people in a room and we want to know the average blood pressure. And so maybe there's some people in the room with really, really high elevated blood pressure. And maybe there's some people in the room with around, what's normal, like 120/80. And then there's some people in the room who have like a really low blood pressure. And if you take the average across all the people in that room, maybe you'll get a number like, who knows, maybe like 130/85, right? So that's somewhat elevated than what we consider normal. So what would you do to treat those people then based on that average? Maybe you would say, okay, there's no one here that's at like significant risk. So we're gonna do this kind of minimal intervention that at least will correct for this like slightly elevated blood pressure, right? But let's stop there. This is not helpful for the people in the room who have really high blood pressure, who are not being represented by that average. And this is also not helpful for the people in the room who have a really low blood pressure, who are not being represented by the average. And this is something that really comes up a lot in the research is sometimes you may not be represented by what is average. So what do we do about this? So when you look at a study and it reports some sort of average finding, what's really important is that you take into consideration what you know about yourself, your family history, your own predispositions, what you know about your own behavior, etc. That's why in a doctor's office, or with a therapist, they ask you very specific questions about you in your life, because they're trying to understand, well, how do these general trends that we know about on a broad population level apply to you as an individual, because you are indeed a unique snowflake, right, with your own experiences and your own history and your own genetics. And the last point that I am going to make is that it kind of dovetails with point 2, is a lot of neuroscience and psychology research focuses on what we call weird populations. And that stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And this term weird was coined, and I'll link the paper that I kind of first coined this term. Because again, and based on a statistic in this paper, about 90% of social sciences samples include weird populations, when weird populations only compose about 12% of the global population. So because of this, a lot of studies might not always apply to everyone based on your culture, your background, your experiences. I say this with a grain of salt and an important caveat, that just because you're not maybe represented within this sample does not mean that we should poo-poo every study as if it doesn't apply to you. But what I do mean is that if you read a study and you see that there's this average reported in a certain sample, just take again into consideration what you know about yourself, your background, and also when you're in medical spaces or in a therapy setting, I really, really heavily emphasize always advocating for your own experiences. So I'll give you an example of why this is important. So there's this thing called the Muller-Lyer illusion, and I'll link it again in the description box. Basically, it's like these two lines that are the same length, but one of them has arrows that are sort of pointing in, and the other has arrows that are pointing out. And when this illusion is shown to US students, college students, a lot of them are fooled when they're asked, are these lines sort of the same length or are they different lengths? To them, it looks like different lengths. However, if this illusion is shown to people in different societies, places where there's maybe more foraging-based societies and less industrialization, they actually don't get as fooled by this illusion, and the effect is a lot weaker. And part of this, is because maybe people who grew up in industrialized societies are more used to sharp right angles of buildings and stuff like that. And this is just an example of how where you grow up really influences how you see the world. So take this example and now think about the fact that we talk about really complex phenomenon like mental health or how your brain works and why. And when you scale up to these questions and you try to incorporate people's different backgrounds and how they see things, it can become really complex. And I can save specifics for why psychology, neuroscience research is so weird population-based for another time, but a lot of people are working towards trying to get just more different types of experiences into our samples so that we can account for, different experiences that people have and how it affects some of the variables that we're looking at. I think those 3 things are really the most important things to know about how to consume science so that you can make decisions that align with your values and help you live a life that's most fulfilled for you.